Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Lily, and I'm absolutely thrilled you're here today. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to remind you of three important things that really help us out here at the podcast. If you're finding value in what we're discussing, please take a second and hit that like button. It genuinely helps the algorithm and lets me know you're loving the content. Seriously, it makes such a difference. And if you think your friends or family would benefit from today's conversation, please share this episode with them. Word of mouth is absolutely everything in this space, and I'm so grateful when you share our work. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you'll get notified whenever we drop a new episode, and you won't miss out on any of the incredible conversations we're having here. And here's something I really want to highlight. Make sure you check out our dedicated podcast playlist. We've curated some amazing episodes in there, and if you're just discovering us, that playlist is the perfect place to start exploring all the content we've created. So today, I want to talk about something that has genuinely transformed the way I communicate, and honestly, it's changed the way I move through the world. We're going to explore the fundamental principles that separate people who can command attention through their words from those who struggle to articulate their thoughts clearly. Have you ever sat in a room and listened to someone speak, and you were just completely mesmerized? Not because they were saying anything revolutionary, but because of the way they said it. That's what today's episode is all about. I call these the 5 pillars of linguistic mastery. And I genuinely believe that understanding and implementing even one of these principles will elevate your communication game significantly. Now, I want to be transparent with you from the start. These aren't quick fixes. These aren't magic pills that you swallow and suddenly become a brilliant communicator. What they are, though, is a framework. They're a set of proven strategies that, when practiced consistently, will absolutely transform the way you express yourself, whether you're in a boardroom, on a date, at a family dinner, or even just texting with friends. The reason I'm so passionate about this topic is because I've lived on both sides of this equation. I've been the person who stumbled over words, who felt like my brain was moving faster than my mouth, who finished conversations and thought, man, I wish I'd said that differently. And I've also experienced the transformation that comes from intentionally working on your communication skills. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're at a networking event and you're trying to explain what you do to someone you just met. One version might sound like, I basically work in marketing and stuff, helping companies, get their message out there. Another version might sound like, I specialize in crafting compelling narratives that help brands connect authentically with their target audiences through strategic communication. Same job, completely different impact, right? That difference isn't about being fake or putting on an accent or pretending to be something you're not. It's about having access to the right tools, the right words, the right pacing, the right vocal inflection to express what you already know in a way that lands with impact and intention. Pillar 1. Expanding your vocabulary foundation. All right, let's talk about the first pillar, and this one is absolutely foundational. I call it expanding your vocabulary foundation, and it's all about understanding the difference between the words you use and the words you know. So here's something fascinating that I learned, and it completely reframed how I thought about language. Every single person who speaks has what I call a working vocabulary and a reserve vocabulary. Your working vocabulary is made up of the words you naturally reach for. It's the words that live in the front of your mind. When you're having a conversation, when you're writing an email, when you're telling a story, these are the words your brain defaults to automatically, without you even thinking about it. The average person has a working vocabulary of somewhere between 1,500 to maybe 3,000 words. That might sound like a lot, but think about it. You probably use the same 200 words in your everyday conversation without even realizing it. We're creatures of habit, and our language is no exception. We find words that feel comfortable, and we stick with them. But here's where it gets really interesting. Your reserve vocabulary, And this is where the magic happens. Your reserve vocabulary is substantially larger. This is the collection of words that you encounter, that you recognize and understand, but that you don't actively use in your speech. If you're a native English speaker, research suggests that your reserve vocabulary could contain anywhere from 20,000 to 35,000 words, maybe even more. So the question becomes, if you already know all these words, why aren't you using them? Why is your brain defaulting to the same limited set when you have this massive library of vocabulary available to you? Let me give you a really concrete example, because this is where it clicks for most people. Let's say someone asks you, "What did you think of that meal we just had?" Your immediate response might be something like, "Oh, it was really good. I liked it, it was tasty." Your brain reached into your working vocabulary and grabbed the most accessible words: good, liked, tasty. These are comfortable words. You've used them 1,000 times. But let's go deeper. In your reserve vocabulary, you have words like delectable, succulent, exquisitely seasoned, palatable, ambrosial. You know what these words mean. You've read them before. You understand their nuance. But your brain didn't reach for them in that moment because they don't live in your working vocabulary yet. Now, here's the profound realization, and this is something that really shifted my perspective on communication. The default way your brain wants to express something is probably not the best way to express it. Your brain is lazy, in a sense. It's efficient. It wants to use the words that require the least activation energy, the words that are easiest to access. But those words are often generic, they're often imprecise, and they don't do justice to the richness of what you're trying to communicate. Articulacy, real articulacy, is the ability to access the right words at the right moment to express your ideas with precision and intention. It's about moving beyond generic descriptors and reaching for language that's vivid, specific, and evocative. And the beautiful part? This is a skill you can develop. This is something you can practice and improve. So how do you move words from your reserve vocabulary into your working vocabulary? How do you make those sophisticated words feel natural and accessible when you're speaking? There are really two main strategies that work, and I want to walk you through both of them because they're both equally important. The first strategy is what I call deliberate repetition. Now, repetition gets a bad rap sometimes. People think repetition is boring or that it's not sophisticated, but the science behind this is actually really compelling. Research from some of the leading universities found that it typically takes using a word anywhere from 35 to 40 times in different contexts before your brain instinctively reaches for it in your speech. Let me sit with that for a moment. 35 to 40 times. That's not 35 to 40 times in a single day or a single week. That's 35 to 40 separate instances of using that word in different conversations, different contexts, over time. Your brain needs that repetition to build the neural pathways that make that word feel natural and accessible. This is why when you listen to truly articulate speakers, people who are known for their eloquence, their command of language, if you listen to them for even just an hour, you'll notice certain words and phrases repeating. They're not repeating them accidentally. They're repeating them intentionally because they've trained their brains to default to those words. Let me give you an example. Instead of saying, "I have a lot of different information to process," an articulate speaker might say, "I'm navigating a complex tapestry of information." That's a more vivid, more specific way of expressing the same basic idea. But here's the thing, that speaker didn't just start using the word tapestry one day. They probably started actively using it. Maybe they read it in something. And then they deliberately started incorporating it into their speech. They used it again and again in different contexts until their brain made it part of their default vocabulary. So the practical application of this first strategy is simple. Choose words that you want to incorporate into your communication. Be intentional about it. Maybe you want to use words like nuanced or compelling or orchestrate or catalyze. Pick words that resonate with you, words that feel like they belong in your communication style, and then start using them. Use them in conversations, use them in your writing, Use them in your thoughts. Keep using them until they feel natural. The second strategy for expanding your working vocabulary is something I call reflective pausing. This is about training your brain to slow down before you speak and actually take time to excavate your reserved vocabulary for better options. So many of us have this tendency to speak at the speed of thought. We're thinking and talking simultaneously, and what that means is our brains don't have time to search our reserved vocabulary for better words. We just say the first thing that comes to mind. But what if you introduced a pause? What if you trained yourself to ask, in that moment before you speak, a really simple question? Is this the right word? Is there a better way to express this? This might sound small, but the impact is massive. It's like the difference between taking a shallow breath and taking a deep breath. A shallow breath gets some oxygen to your lungs, but it doesn't feel satisfying. A deep breath fully oxygenates your system, and you feel more alive. Reflective pausing is like taking a deep breath with your words. When you give yourself even just a couple of extra seconds before you speak to search your vocabulary, amazing things happen. Your brain actually has time to connect with more sophisticated words. The words you choose become more precise. Your communication becomes more powerful. I started practicing this deliberately about 2 years ago, and it was honestly a game changer for me. Whenever I was about to speak, especially in situations where I wanted my communication to be really impactful, like in important meetings or conversations, I would pause for just a moment and ask myself, what's the most precise word I can use here? What word best captures what I'm trying to convey? At first, it felt awkward. It felt like I was overthinking. But here's what I discovered. People interpret that pause as confidence. They see it as you being thoughtful and intentional with your language. It's not awkward or weird. It's actually the opposite. It signals that you care about your words, that you're not just blurting out the first thing that comes to your mind. And over time, as you practice this reflective pausing, something beautiful happens. Your brain starts to do it automatically. You don't have to consciously think about it anymore. Your brain starts defaulting to more sophisticated vocabulary because you've trained it to search for better options. So the practical homework for this first pillar is twofold. First, identify 5 to 7 words from your reserve vocabulary that you want to incorporate into your working vocabulary. These should be words that feel authentic to you, words that align with your communication style. Then, commit to using them intentionally and repeatedly in your conversations for the next month. Second, start practicing reflective pausing. Before you answer a question or make a statement, take a breath. Ask yourself if there's a better word, a more precise word, available to you. These two practices together will significantly expand your working vocabulary. Pillar 2, the power of strategic silence. All right, let's move into the second pillar, and this one is truly magical. I call it the power of strategic silence. And honestly, it might be one of the most transformative concepts I've learned about communication. We live in a culture of constant noise. We're talking all the time. We're filling every moment with words, with sound. And as a society, we've developed this deep discomfort with silence. If there's a pause in a conversation, we feel like we need to fill it. We feel like silence is awkward, that it suggests we're stupid or that we don't know what to say. But nothing could be further from the truth. One of the biggest breakthroughs I had in my own communication journey was realizing that silence, strategically placed silence, is one of the most powerful tools a speaker has available. Silence isn't empty. Silence isn't a window. Silence is space. It's space for your listener to absorb what you've said. It's space for your brain to formulate your next thought. It's space for tension and anticipation to build. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a speaker who's talking about something important, something they really want you to understand. They're speaking in a steady stream, words flowing without interruption. Now imagine a different speaker saying the same thing, but they pause deliberately before key points. They let statements land before moving on. They use silence to create emphasis and impact. Which one would you find more compelling? The speaker who pauses strategically is more compelling because they're doing something really intelligent. They're giving you time to actually process what they've said. And more than that, they're signaling through that pause that what they're about to say, or what they just said, is important. Pausing says, "This matters. I want you to really hear this." So let's talk about why this is so powerful. When we speak without pausing, we're essentially asking our listener to digest and process information at the speed we're delivering it. But people's minds don't all work at the same speed. Some people need a moment to really internalize what you've said. Some people are visual thinkers, and they need time to create mental images. Some people are auditory processors, and they need time to let the words settle in their mind. By pausing, you're being considerate of how different people process information. There's also a neurological element here that's really fascinating. When you pause before speaking, when you take that moment of silence before you deliver a key point, your brain actually has time to construct a more coherent, more well-thought-out response. You're not just saying the first thing that comes to your mind, you're giving yourself time to think, to organize your thoughts, to choose your words deliberately. I had an experience that really drove this home for me. I was in a high-stakes meeting, and the CEO asked me a really challenging question. My instinct was to immediately jump in with an answer. But I paused. I took a breath. I took maybe 3 seconds of silence before I answered. And in those 3 seconds, my brain formulated a much more thoughtful, much more articulate response than I would have given if I'd just blurted something out immediately. What really surprised me was the reaction in the room. People weren't uncomfortable with the silence. In fact, the opposite happened. People leaned forward slightly, waiting for my response. The pause had created anticipation, and when I finally did speak, my words had more weight. They had more impact. Because people had been waiting, they were really listening. This ties into something that I think is really important to understand about communication. We often think that being articulate means talking more, saying more words, filling more space. But actually, the best communicators in the world understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is shut up. It's to be quiet. It's to let silence do the work for you. Think about some of the most compelling public speakers you've ever heard or watched. If you really pay attention to their speaking patterns, you'll notice these strategic pauses. They're not rushing through their material. They're not cramming as many words as possible into every second. They're pacing themselves. They're using silence as much as they're using words. Now, I want to talk about the practical application of this, because understanding the concept is one thing, but actually implementing it in your own communication is something else entirely. The challenge for most of us is that we're not used to pausing. We're used to filling silence. So it takes conscious practice to rewire that habit. Here's how I recommend approaching this. Start by becoming aware of the pauses that already exist in your natural speech. Notice where you're already pausing. Maybe it's when you're thinking of a specific detail or when you're transitioning between ideas. Once you're aware of those natural pauses, you can start being more intentional about extending them slightly. The second thing is to practice pausing in low-stakes situations first. If you jump straight into pausing deliberately in high-stakes conversations, you might feel self-conscious about it. So start with your friends, your family, people you're comfortable with. Practice pausing and notice how it changes the dynamic of your conversation. Notice how people respond. Then, once you're comfortable with that, you can start incorporating strategic pausing into more formal situations. And I want to be clear about something. When I say pause, I don't mean pause for an uncomfortably long time. We're talking about maybe 2 to 3 seconds. That's enough time for your brain to formulate a thought, for your listener to process what you've said, but not so long that it feels weird. The reason strategic silence is so powerful is because it signals several things at once. First, it signals confidence. A person who pauses before speaking generally comes across as more confident than someone who's rushing through their words. Second, it signals respect for your listener. You're giving them time to actually hear and process what you're saying. Third, It signals thoughtfulness. You're clearly thinking about what you're saying, not just word vomiting all over the place. I also want to talk about what I call internal pausing. This is when you pause not to create dramatic effect, but to actually give yourself time to search your vocabulary for better words. It's that reflective pausing we talked about earlier, but we're emphasizing it here because it's tied so directly to silence and the power of silence. When you're in a conversation and you feel like you're about to say something, but you pause for a moment to think about whether there's a better way to express it, that's internal pausing. Your listener sees you thinking and they respect that. They understand that you're being intentional. You're not perfect, but you're thoughtful. And that's actually more compelling than false perfection. There's also something called external pausing, which is when you pause between points or between ideas to let what you've said really sink in. This is the dramatic pause, the one that creates emphasis and impact. These pauses are powerful because they give your listener a moment to really absorb the significance of what you've said. One more thing I want to emphasize about strategic silence is that it's not about being pretentious or putting on an act. It's about being authentic and intentional. You're not pausing because you're trying to seem smarter or more sophisticated. You're pausing because it makes your communication clearer, more impactful, and more genuine. The practice for this pillar is relatively simple. Start noticing where you naturally pause in your speech. Then, start intentionally extending those pauses by maybe half a second or a full second. Practice this in comfortable situations where you feel at ease, and then, gradually, introduce strategic pausing into your more formal communications. Pay attention to how people respond. You'll likely find that people actually respond more positively to your communication when you're using strategic silence effectively. All right, let's dive in. Pillar 3, eliminating linguistic clutter. Okay, we're on to the third pillar, and this one is about cleaning up your communication. I call it eliminating linguistic clutter, and it's all about those filler words and verbal tics that undermine your credibility and clarity. So let's be real for a second. Most of us use filler words. We use them all the time, probably without even realizing it. Words and phrases like like, basically, sort of, kind of, actually, literally. We pepper our speech with these words almost unconsciously, and here's the thing, we do it for a reason. But the reasons we do it actually work against our credibility and our communication effectiveness. First, let's talk about why we use filler words at all. It's not because we're stupid or because we're bad communicators. We use filler words because they serve a function. They give us time to think. When you say, you're essentially buying yourself a moment to formulate your next thought. Your brain is processing, but your mouth keeps working, and the filler word fills that gap. It's actually a neurological phenomenon. Your brain speaks faster than your mouth can keep up, so we fill the gaps with these filler words. The second reason we use filler words is because we're uncomfortable with silence. We've been conditioned to believe that silence is awkward, that it signals confusion or intelligence. So instead of allowing for that silence, we fill it with a filler word. We'd rather say something meaningless than let there be a moment of quiet. The third reason is social. We use filler words to maintain what we call conversational control. In a conversation, if there's silence, someone else might jump in and start talking. By using a filler word, by keeping some sound coming out of your mouth, you're signaling that you're still speaking, that you still have control of the conversational turn. Now, here's the problem with relying on filler words. Every time you use them, you're creating a slight disconnect between you and your listener. They might not consciously notice it, but on some level, filler words undermine your credibility. They make you sound less confident, less authoritative, less articulate. And in high-stakes situations, job interviews, important presentations, moments where you really need your communication to land, that matters. I used to be someone who relied heavily on filler words. I was the and like queen. I use these words so much that people probably could have made a drinking game out of counting how many times I said like in a single conversation. And I didn't even realize I was doing it until someone pointed it out to me. The turning point for me was when I started to actually listen to my own speech. I recorded myself in conversations and I listened back. It was honestly a little mortifying. I could hear how much I was undermining my own communication with these filler words. But it was also incredibly motivating because I realized that I could fix this. This was something within my control. So let me share the 2 primary strategies that helped me reduce my reliance on filler words, and I think they'll help you too. The first strategy is what I call auditory awareness. This is about training yourself to actually hear the words coming out of your mouth. It sounds simple, but we're usually so caught up in what we're saying that we're not really listening to how we're saying it. To develop auditory awareness, I started paying very close attention to the endings of my words. Instead of just letting words flow out of my mouth without really hearing them, I started listening to the endings. I'd focus on how each word terminates, how each sound resolves. And something really interesting happened. When I focused on the endings of my words, 2 things occurred simultaneously. First, my speaking naturally slowed down. I couldn't rush through my words while I was simultaneously listening to the endings of those words. It created a natural pacing that was actually beneficial. Second, because I was focusing on the words themselves, I became much more aware of when I was about to use a filler word. I could catch myself before the word came out of my mouth, or at least notice it in the moment, rather than being completely unaware of my speech patterns. The practice for auditory awareness is to deliberately listen to how you speak for about a week. Just be an observer of your own communication. Notice where the filler words are. Notice your speech patterns. Notice when you tend to use filler words most frequently. Do you use them when you're nervous? When you're excited? When you're talking about a topic you're not super confident about? This awareness is the foundation for change. The second strategy is what I call intentional silence maintenance. This is about training yourself to be comfortable with quiet, with letting there be moments of silence in your speech. The reason filler words exist is partly because we're uncomfortable with silence. So if you can become comfortable with silence, if you can train your brain to not feel the need to fill every gap, you eliminate the primary reason you'd use filler words in the first place. Here's how I did this. Instead of starting to speak immediately when someone asked me a question or when it was my turn to talk, I would pause. I'd take a moment. I'd give myself a beat of silence to organize my thoughts before I said anything. And here's the thing. I discovered that people weren't bothered by that silence. In fact, they respected it. They saw it as me thinking, as me being thoughtful. It wasn't awkward at all. Then, when I was in the middle of speaking, if I felt like I was about to use a filler word, I would just stop. I would let there be a moment of silence instead. And the more I did that, the more comfortable with silence I became. My brain learned that it was okay to not be constantly producing sound. Now, I want to be clear about something. Filler words are not inherently evil. They're a natural part of speech, and using them occasionally is totally fine. The problem comes when you overuse them, when they become a crutch, when they start to undermine your communication. There's definitely a spectrum here. Using a filler word once in a while is no big deal, but if you're using them constantly, if you can barely get through a sentence without using at least one filler word, that's something worth addressing. One other technique that's been really helpful for me is what I call strategic substitution. If you find yourself about to use a filler word, sometimes you can substitute it with nothing, just silence, as we've talked about, but sometimes you can substitute it with a more intentional word or phrase. Instead of saying, I think we should, you could say, I believe we should. Instead of, like, this is really important, you could say, this is genuinely important. You're still using words, but you're using words that are more intentional, more articulate than filler words. Another technique that I found useful is what I call the mouth-closed approach. This might sound weird, but hear me out. So many of us have the habit of starting to talk before we even know what we're going to say. We open our mouth, and then our brain catches up. In that moment between opening our mouth and our brain being ready, what do? We insert a filler word. Let me think about that. is basically our default when we haven't thought about it yet. Instead of starting with a filler word, I trained myself to keep my mouth closed until I knew what I was going to say. Until I had at least the first few words of my response formulated in my mind. This eliminated a huge source of filler words in my speech. No more, I think. Instead, I'd pause with my mouth closed, formulate my first few words, and then start speaking. Much cleaner, much more articulate. The practice for this pillar is to diagnose your personal patterns with filler words. Record yourself in conversations if you can. Listen back, count how many filler words you're using. Identify which words you use most frequently. Then, commit to addressing one filler word at a time. Don't try to eliminate all of them at once. That's overwhelming. Pick your most frequent filler word and focus on eliminating that one. Use the techniques we've talked about: auditory awareness, intentional silence maintenance, strategic substitution, or the mouth-closed approach. Once you've significantly reduced one filler word, move on to the next one. It usually takes a few weeks of conscious practice for a new communication pattern to feel natural, so be patient with yourself. You're rewiring decades of habitual speech patterns. That takes time, but it's absolutely worth it because clean, articulate speech without unnecessary filler words is just more powerful, more credible, and more effective. Pillar 4. Curating your linguistic environment. All right, we're moving into the fourth pillar, and this is something that I think a lot of people overlook, but it's absolutely fundamental. I call it curating your linguistic environment, and it's based on a really simple principle. You become what you're exposed to. So let's think about this. The way you speak right now, in this moment, is not something you woke up one day and decided. It's not like you were born with a particular way of speaking. Your communication style, your vocabulary, your speech patterns, your mannerisms, all of this has been shaped by your environment. It's been shaped by the people you've spent time with, the media you've consumed, the things you've read, the conversations you've been part of, the culture you're immersed in. This is both good news and important to recognize. It's good news because it means you can change it. If your current communication style was learned through environmental exposure, then you can learn a different way of communicating by changing your environment and what you expose yourself to. But it's also important to recognize because it means you need to be intentional about what you're allowing into your mind. Let me give you a concrete example. If you spend most of your time consuming low-quality media, content that's full of slang, vulgarity, and imprecise language, you will start to internalize those communication patterns. Your brain will literally absorb them, and without you even realizing it, those patterns will start showing up in your own speech. On the other hand, if you spend time consuming high-quality media, content that features articulate, expressive language, your brain will absorb those patterns instead. Now, I'm not suggesting that you need to completely overhaul your entire life. I'm not saying you need to stop listening to music you enjoy or watching shows that entertain you. What I'm saying is that you should become aware of the quality of language that you're regularly exposed to, and you should probably introduce more sources of high-quality language into your life. There are a few reasons why this is important. First, reading and listening to articulate speech exposes you to new words, new phrases, new ways of expressing ideas. Your reserved vocabulary expands just by being exposed to rich language. When you encounter a new word in a book or hear someone use a phrase that catches your attention, your brain is registering that. You might not use it immediately, but you're adding it to your mental library. Second, when you're exposed to articulate speech, you start to understand the music and the melody of language at a deeper level. You understand how articulate speakers pace their words, how they use emphasis, how they construct their sentences. You internalize the patterns of effective communication without even necessarily meaning to. It's like how listening to music trains your ear to recognize different musical patterns. Listening to articulate speech trains your ear to recognize and eventually reproduce those patterns. Third, consuming high-quality language actually makes you think differently. There's research that suggests that the quality of language you're exposed to affects your cognitive processes. When you're reading beautifully constructed sentences, when you're listening to speakers who are using language with precision and intention, it affects the way you think, the way you process information, the way you construct your own ideas. So let's talk about what it looks like to curate your linguistic environment. First, you need to take inventory of where you're getting language input. This includes the people you spend time with, the media you consume, the books you read, the podcasts you listen to, the shows you watch, the music you listen to, all of it. This is your linguistic diet, and like your physical diet, it matters. Once you've taken inventory, you can start to evaluate the quality. Is the language you're being exposed to articulate and expressive, or is it sloppy and imprecise? Is it rich and varied, or is it repetitive and generic? Does it inspire you to think deeply, or does it kind of numb your brain? Now, here's where I want to be really honest with you. When I talk about high-quality language, I'm not talking about using pretentious vocabulary or affecting some fancy accent. I'm not talking about suddenly becoming a snob about language. What I'm talking about is language that's been crafted with care, language that's precise and expressive, language that shows evidence of thoughtfulness. Some of the best sources of high-quality language are books. Now, I'm not saying you need to become someone who reads for hours every day if that's not already part of your life. But if you can incorporate regular reading into your life, it will absolutely impact your communication. And I'd recommend reading across different genres and styles. Read novels for eloquence and emotional expression. Read nonfiction for clarity and precision. Read essays for structure and argumentation. Read poetry for the musicality of language. Other great sources include podcasts and audiobooks. If you listen to podcasts that feature thoughtful speakers, that's exposing you to quality language. Documentaries are great too. TED Talks are excellent. Movies and shows can be sources of quality language, especially if you're being intentional about what you're watching. But here's something I want to emphasize, and I think this is important. You don't have to get rid of the things you already love. You're not giving up all of your entertainment, you're just introducing more sources of high-quality language into your media diet. So maybe you love reality television. Okay, keep watching it, but also start listening to a quality podcast in addition to the reality TV. Maybe you love fast-paced action movies. Keep enjoying them, but also read a chapter or two of a well-written book before bed. I also want to talk about the people you spend time with, because they're a huge part of your linguistic environment. The conversations you have, the way people around you speak, the vocabulary that people in your circles use, all of this shapes your communication. This doesn't mean you need to switch friend groups or anything dramatic like that, but it does mean that you might want to be intentional about spending time with people who communicate in ways that inspire you. This could mean finding communities or groups organized around language and communication. It could mean seeking out mentors who are articulate and who can model good communication for you. It could mean joining speaking clubs or debate teams or writing groups. When you're regularly around people who are thoughtful about language, who use language well, you naturally start to incorporate those patterns into your own speech. One more thing I want to say about curating your linguistic environment is that this is a gradual process. You're not going to transform your communication overnight by starting to listen to different podcasts. But over months and years, if you're intentional about the language you're exposing yourself to, your communication will evolve. Your vocabulary will expand. Your ability to express yourself precisely will improve. Your thinking will become more sophisticated. The practical homework for this pillar is to do a linguistic audit. Spend a day or two just observing where you're getting language input. Notice the books you're reading, the shows you're watching, the podcasts you're listening to, the conversations you're having. Then rate each of these on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of language quality. Be honest, no judgment. This is just an observation. Once you've done that audit, identify 2 or 3 sources of high-quality language that you could realistically add to your daily or weekly routine. It doesn't have to be a major commitment. Maybe it's listening to 1 quality podcast per week. Maybe it's reading 1 chapter of a well-written book per day. Maybe it's having 1 conversation per week with someone who's articulate and thoughtful. Just identify 2 or 3 things you can realistically add and commit to adding them for the next month. Pillar 5. Mastering your vocal instrument. All right, we're on to the fifth and final pillar, and this is something that I think is often overlooked in conversations about communication. I call it mastering your vocal instrument, and it's all about understanding that the way you sound matters just as much as the words you choose. So here's something that's really important to understand. Articulate communication isn't just about having a big vocabulary and using the right words. If it were that simple, people who just memorize dictionaries would be the best communicators in the world, right? But they're not. You can have all the right words and still be a boring, ineffective communicator if you're not using your voice strategically. Your voice is an instrument. It's like a musical instrument that you carry with you. Just like a musician can play the same note in a dozen different ways with different emphasis, different timing, different quality, you can say the same word in a dozen different ways, and each of those ways creates a different impact. Think about what I mean. If I say the word beautiful in a flat, monotone voice, it sounds kind of meh, right? But if I say beautiful with warmth and emotion in my voice, with slight variation in pitch, with a thoughtful pause before it, suddenly the word has more impact. The word hasn't changed, but the delivery has, and that changes everything. This is something that truly great communicators understand at a deep level. They understand that language is not just the words you speak. Language is the entire package. The words, the pacing, the pitch, the volume, the emphasis, the pauses, the emotional tone, all of those elements together create the full communication experience. And here's the thing that really excites me about this pillar. You have so much control over all of those vocal elements. You can learn to manipulate your voice, to use it more expressively, to make your communication more compelling. And you don't need a naturally beautiful voice to do this. You don't need a specific accent or a particular vocal quality. You just need to be intentional about how you're using your voice. Let me talk about the specific vocal elements that matter most. The first is pitch. Pitch refers to how high or low your voice is. One of the biggest mistakes people make is speaking in a flat, unchanging pitch. It gets boring. Your listener's brain actually tunes it out after a while. They're literally not paying as much attention. But when you vary your pitch, when you go up and down, when you use pitch to add emphasis and emotion, suddenly your listener is engaged. The second element is volume. How loud or soft you're speaking matters. Sometimes speaking softly can actually be more commanding than speaking loudly, especially if you're usually loud. Varying your volume, getting quieter at important moments, and then speaking with more volume at other moments creates dynamic and interest. The third element is speed. The pace at which you speak affects how your message is received. If you're speaking really fast, people might perceive you as anxious or like you're not confident in what you're saying. If you're speaking really slowly, people might think you're over-explaining or that you think they don't understand. But if you vary your speed, if you slow down for important points and move along a bit faster during less crucial moments, you're creating a rhythm that's compelling. The fourth element is emphasis. This is about where you place stress in your words and your sentences. If you emphasize the right words, you can completely change the meaning of a sentence. For example, if I say, "I didn't say he stole the money," the meaning changes depending on which word I emphasize. If I emphasize "I," it suggests someone else said it. If I emphasize "say," it suggests I indicated it some other way. If I emphasize "he," it suggests someone else stole it. Same sentence, different meanings based on where I place emphasis. The fifth element is vocal tone and quality. This refers to the emotion or attitude that comes through in your voice. Are you speaking with warmth, with confidence, with curiosity, with passion? Your vocal tone communicates emotion and attitude, and it affects how your message is received. Now, one of the best ways to develop mastery over your vocal instrument is through a practice that many people wouldn't necessarily expect: reading poetry out loud. I know it might sound a little strange, but hear me out. Poetry is this incredible tool for developing vocal nuance and expression because poetry almost demands that you use your voice expressively. When you read a poem out loud, you can't just monotone your way through it. The structure of the poem, the rhythm, the rhymes, they all pull you toward reading with more variation in your pitch and pace. And as you practice reading poetry with expression, you're training your vocal mechanisms. You're teaching your voice to be more flexible, more expressive, more capable of conveying different emotions and ideas. Poetry also teaches you about the musicality of language. When you read poetry, you start to hear language as music. You understand how words flow together, how rhythm affects meaning, how the sounds of words interact. And once you develop that ear for the musicality of language, you can start applying those same principles to your everyday speech. I started reading poetry out loud about a year ago, and I noticed pretty quickly that my speaking became more expressive. I was varying my pitch more naturally. I was using pauses more effectively. My pacing was more intentional. It wasn't like I consciously changed my speech patterns. It was more subtle than that. But by training my voice through poetry, my vocal expression improved overall. Another practice that's incredibly helpful is recording yourself speaking and then listening back. This can feel a bit cringy because most of us don't like hearing our own voices, but it's genuinely one of the most effective ways to improve your vocal delivery. When you listen back to yourself, you can hear things that you can't hear when you're in the moment of speaking. You can hear where you're monotoning. You can hear where you could be using more pitch variation. You can hear where you're speaking too fast or too slow. You can hear where you're not emphasizing the right words. You can hear whether you're coming across with the tone and attitude you intend. It's like holding up a mirror to your speech, and it's incredibly valuable. Here's what I'd recommend doing. Record yourself speaking about a topic that you're passionate about. Maybe it's something you're knowledgeable about, something you genuinely care about. Speak for maybe 2 to 3 minutes. Then listen back. Don't judge yourself harshly, just observe. Notice things. Notice the patterns. Notice where you might want to add more vocal variation. Notice where you could emphasize differently. Then record yourself again, this time being intentional about addressing some of those things. Maybe focus on varying your pitch more, or on using more deliberate pauses, or on emphasizing different words. Then listen back and compare the two recordings. You'll be amazed at the difference. And over time, as you do this, your vocal skills naturally improve. You develop a more nuanced, more expressive way of speaking. Your communication becomes more compelling. I also want to talk about something called vocal authority. This is about speaking in a way that conveys confidence and credibility. It's not about being loud or aggressive. It's actually more subtle than that. Vocal authority comes from a combination of factors: clarity of articulation, appropriate pacing, confident pitch that doesn't shoot up at the end of statements, which makes them sound like questions, and a sense of relaxation in your voice. When you're tense or anxious, that comes through in your voice. Your voice gets tight, your pitch gets higher, you might rush through your words. But when you're relaxed and confident, that also comes through in your voice. Your voice becomes fuller, richer, more commanding. So developing vocal authority is partly about technical vocal skills, but it's also about developing the confidence and relaxation that allow your voice to sound authoritative. One way to develop vocal authority is through breathing. Good, deep breathing is foundational to a powerful voice. When you breathe deeply from your diaphragm, your voice has more resonance, more power, more richness. But when you're breathing shallowly from your chest, your voice gets thin and weak. So practicing diaphragmatic breathing can actually help your vocal authority. Another thing that impacts your vocal expression is your physical posture and movement. If you're slouching or hunched over, that affects how your voice sounds. If you're standing tall with your shoulders back, your voice naturally has more power. If you're moving with confidence and intention, that comes through in your voice. So part of mastering your vocal instrument is also about being aware of your physical presence. Now, I want to be really clear about something. When I talk about mastering your vocal instrument, I'm not suggesting that you should put on an affected accent or affect some false persona. I'm not suggesting that you should become someone you're not. What I'm suggesting is that you should develop the flexibility and control in your voice to be able to express yourself more effectively. You should be able to convey different emotions, different intensities, different ideas through your voice. But you should still sound like yourself. The key is authenticity combined with skill. You're being authentic, you're still yourself, still your personality, but you're also developing the skill to communicate more effectively. It's like an actor. A good actor is still recognizably themselves, but they have the skill to convey different characters and emotions. You can develop that same skill with your voice. The practice for this pillar involves several components. First, start reading poetry out loud regularly. Find poems that resonate with you and practice reading them with expression. Pay attention to how the poem pulls you toward reading with certain pacing and emphasis. Let the poem guide your vocal expression. Do this for about 10 to 15 minutes several times a week. Second, start recording yourself speaking and listening back. Choose different topics and different contexts, maybe a casual conversation, maybe a more formal explanation of something, maybe something you're passionate about. Listen back and observe without judgment. Notice patterns. Notice what you'd like to improve. Then, practice with intention. Third, become aware of your breathing. Practice diaphragmatic breathing, where you breathe deeply into your belly rather than shallowly from your chest. This will naturally improve your vocal power and resonance. Fourth, pay attention to your physical posture when you're communicating. Stand tall, relax your shoulders, and move with intention. Notice how different postures affect the way your voice sounds and feels. And finally, practice varying your pitch, pace, volume, and emphasis intentionally. Pick a short passage or a story that you know well and practice telling it in different ways. Maybe tell it very quickly. Maybe tell it very slowly. Maybe tell it with a lot of emphasis and emotion. Maybe tell it more matter-of-factly. Notice how each variation changes the impact of the story. This variation practice is incredibly useful for developing flexibility in your vocal expression. All right, so we've gone through all 5 pillars. We've talked about expanding your vocabulary foundation, mastering strategic silence, eliminating linguistic clutter, curating your linguistic environment, and mastering your vocal instrument. Now I want to talk about how to actually integrate all of this into your life in a way that's sustainable and effective. One thing I want to emphasize is that these pillars don't exist in isolation. They work together. They complement each other. When you're expanding your vocabulary and you're also using strategic pauses, the pauses give your more sophisticated vocabulary time to land with impact. When you're eliminating filler words and you're also varying your vocal expression, your cleaner speech becomes even more compelling. When you're curating your linguistic environment and you're also recording yourself and listening back, you start to notice more deeply the patterns of articulate speech in the media you're consuming. So the way I recommend approaching this is not to try to work on all 5 pillars at once. That's overwhelming. Instead, I recommend picking one pillar to focus on for a month. Dive deep into that one. Make it your practice. Then, in the second month, add a second pillar while maintaining the first one. By month 5, you've incorporated all 5 pillars into your communication practice. Let me walk you through what that might look like practically. In month 1, let's say you focus on eliminating linguistic clutter. You do your diagnostic, you identify your most common filler words, you start practicing auditory awareness and intentional silence. You're really focused on cleaning up your speech. At the end of the month, this new way of speaking should start to feel relatively natural. In month 2, you maintain the work you're doing on filler words, it's now becoming habitual, but you add strategic pausing. You start practicing reflective pausing before you speak. You start using external pauses for emphasis. You're combining cleaner speech with more intentional pacing. These two together create immediate improvement in your communication. In month 3, you add vocabulary expansion. You've chosen 5 to 7 new words to incorporate into your working vocabulary, and you're using them intentionally. You're practicing reflective pausing to give yourself time to search for better words. Your communication is now cleaner, more intentional, and more sophisticated. In month 4, you add curating your linguistic environment. You've done your linguistic audit, and you've started introducing sources of high-quality language into your life. You're reading more, listening to quality content, being intentional about who and what you expose yourself to. This is supporting your vocabulary expansion and continuing to improve all the other pillars. In month 5, you add vocal mastery. You're reading poetry out loud. You're recording yourself and listening back. You're working on vocal variation and expression. Your communication now has the full package: clean language, strategic pausing, sophisticated vocabulary, high-quality linguistic environment, and expressive vocal delivery. By the end of 5 months, you've completely transformed your communication. But here's the thing: these practices need to continue. Communication skills are not something you master once and then you're done. They're something you continue to practice and refine throughout your life. I want to talk a little bit about what sustainable practice looks like, because I think a lot of people try to improve their communication and they go hard for a couple of weeks and then they stop. And then they wonder why they don't see lasting change. The reason is because communication patterns are deeply ingrained. They're habits that have been built up over decades, and changing habits requires consistent, ongoing practice. So here's what I recommend. First, identify your primary practice. This is the one thing that you're going to commit to doing every single day or several times a week. For some people, this might be recording themselves speaking and listening back. For others, it might be reading poetry out loud. For others, it might be practicing strategic pausing in conversations. Choose one primary practice that feels doable for you, something you'll actually stick with. Then identify your supporting practices. These are the things you're going to do less frequently, maybe once a week or once a month, but that support your primary practice. These might include doing a linguistic audit of your media consumption, seeking out speaking opportunities where you can practice, or journaling about your communication patterns. Finally, identify your maintenance practices. These are the things that you maintain once they become habitual. Like, once you've pretty much eliminated your filler words, you don't need to focus on that as intensively anymore. But you still maintain it. You still notice if you're falling back into old patterns, and you gently correct yourself. I also want to talk about the importance of getting feedback. It's really hard to assess your own communication accurately. You're too close to it. You have blind spots. So I really recommend finding people whose communication you respect and asking them for honest feedback about your communication. This could be a mentor, a friend, a family member. And when they give you feedback, don't get defensive. Listen, really hear what they're saying. Even if it's hard to hear, feedback is a gift because it shows you blind spots that you might not otherwise see. Another thing that really helps is to find a community of people who are also working on their communication. This could be a speaking club like Toastmasters, a writing group, a debate club, a podcast group, whatever. When you're around other people who are intentional about communication, it becomes easier to maintain your own commitment to improvement. You're all doing it together. And finally, I want to talk about the importance of celebrating your progress. As you work on these pillars, you're going to notice improvements. Maybe people start asking you to speak at events. Maybe someone compliments you on how eloquent you are. Maybe you notice that you're able to express ideas more clearly. Celebrate those wins. Notice them. Acknowledge them. Because celebrating progress reinforces the habits and keeps you motivated. Okay, so I want to talk about what this looks like in real life. Because I know that understanding these concepts is one thing, but actually applying them in real situations is another. So let me walk you through a few different scenarios and show you how these pillars come into play. Let's imagine you're in a job interview. This is a high-stakes situation where your communication really matters. The interviewer asks you, "Tell me about a time when you had to solve a complex problem at work." The default response, using your old patterns, your working vocabulary without these skills, might sound like, there was this problem with, our system, and it was kind of broken, I guess. And so I talked to my team, and we figured out how to fix it. It was pretty good. Now, let's apply the pillars. You're using a more sophisticated vocabulary. Pillar 1. You're pausing before you speak to formulate your thoughts. Pillar 2. You're not using filler words. Pillar 3. Your voice is varied and expressive. Pillar 5. Your response might sound like, I recall a particularly challenging situation where we discovered a critical inefficiency in our database architecture. Rather than panicking, I took a moment to assess the issue, then convened with my team to brainstorm solutions. We implemented a multi-layered approach that not only resolved the immediate problem, but actually improved our system's overall efficiency by 20%. Same basic information, but completely different impact, right? The second response sounds more articulate, more confident, more professional, and that person is much more likely to get the job. Let's imagine another scenario. You're at a dinner party, and you're trying to impress someone you're interested in romantically. The conversation is about travel. Without the pillars, you might say, oh yeah, I like travel. I've been to a bunch of places. Like, I went to Italy and it was awesome. The food was really good, and I saw, old buildings and stuff. It was cool. With the pillars, you might say, I'm genuinely passionate about travel, particularly about experiencing how different cultures approach daily life. When I traveled through Italy, I was captivated not just by the iconic monuments, but by the visceral experience of the food culture. The way Italians approach meals with such intentionality and presence really transformed my understanding of what it means to truly nourish yourself. I'm already planning my next journey. Again, same experience, but communicated with much more articulacy and intention. Which version do you think would be more compelling to someone you're interested in? Let's try one more scenario. You're presenting an idea to your boss or to a team. This is important for your career. Without the pillars. So, I have this idea and, I think it could help our company, It's basically about, doing things differently, and I think it would, make things better, I'm not totally sure about all the details, but I think it's pretty good. With the pillars, I'd like to present a strategic initiative that I believe could significantly enhance our operational efficiency. The core idea is to recalibrate our current processes with specific attention to where we're experiencing bottlenecks. I've identified 3 key areas where implementation could yield substantial improvements. I've prepared some data to support this proposal, and I'm confident that we can discuss the logistics of rollout once we've aligned on the vision. Which person sounds like they deserve a promotion? Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying that you need to become someone you're not. You don't need to suddenly start using overly fancy language or pretending to be something you're not. What I'm saying is that you should have access to more articulate ways of expressing yourself. You should be able to communicate in ways that reflect the sophistication of your thinking. And the pillars we've talked about give you those tools. One more thing I want to mention about real-world application is that different contexts might call for different registers of formality. In a job interview, you might use more formal language. With close friends, you might be more casual. But even in casual contexts, you can benefit from these pillars. You can still eliminate filler words. You can still use strategic pausing. You can still use more expressive language. You're just calibrating the level of formality to match the context. All right, so I want to talk about some challenges that people commonly face when they're trying to implement these pillars, because I've definitely faced them myself, and I've seen others face them too. The first challenge is that it feels awkward or inauthentic at first. When you start intentionally using new vocabulary, or when you start pausing deliberately, it can feel weird. It can feel like you're putting on an act. And I want to validate that feeling. It is going to feel a little awkward at first. That's completely normal. You're rewiring communication patterns that have been in place for decades. Of course it's going to feel awkward, but here's what I found. If you persist past that awkwardness, it goes away. After about 2 to 3 weeks of consistent practice, new communication patterns start to feel natural. Your brain starts incorporating them into your default behavior. The awkwardness fades, and suddenly, this new way of speaking feels just as authentic as your old way of speaking. Maybe even more authentic because it's actually reflecting your thoughts and your personality more accurately. The second challenge is that people sometimes feel like they're being judged or criticized when they're trying to improve their communication. Maybe they try to use a new word and they feel like they're using it wrong. Or they pause and they feel like people are judging them for the pause. This can make people really self-conscious. My advice here is to remember that most people are too focused on their own stuff to be critically analyzing your communication. And the people who do notice you're making changes to the way you communicate, most of them will respect that. They'll see it as you putting effort into self-improvement, and that's a good thing. The third challenge is consistency. It's easy to work on communication skills for a week or two, and then life gets busy and you fall back into old patterns. Suddenly, you're using filler words again, you're not pausing deliberately anymore, and all that progress feels lost. What I found really helps with this is to make your communication practice as easy and automatic as possible. For example, instead of trying to remember to practice strategic pausing in all contexts, maybe you just practice it in one specific context, like in team meetings at work or in conversations with a specific person. Once that becomes habitual, you can expand to other contexts. But starting small and specific makes it more manageable. The fourth challenge is that sometimes you'll regress. You'll be doing really well with your communication practice, and then you'll have a stressful week and you'll find yourself falling back into old patterns. You'll use filler words, you won't pause, you'll revert to your old vocabulary. And then you might feel discouraged. But here's what I want you to understand. Regression is normal. It's part of the process. You haven't failed, you've just had a moment where you fell back into old patterns. It happens to everyone. The key is to not make it a big deal. Just notice it, and the next time you're in a situation where you can practice, you jump back in. You don't need to beat yourself up about it. The fifth challenge is that some people struggle with the specifics of how to practice. Like, they understand the concepts, but they're not sure how to actually practice them in their daily life. They're not sure what realistic practice looks like. So let me give you some really concrete examples of how to practice each of these pillars in your everyday life. For vocabulary expansion, you could choose one new word per week, and you could use it in at least 2 conversations that week. You could also spend 10 minutes reading and highlighting new words that you encounter. You could set up a space where you collect interesting words and phrases that you encounter. For strategic pausing, you could practice in one specific context each day. Maybe it's when you answer questions in a meeting. Maybe it's when you're having dinner with your family. You deliberately pause before you answer. That's your practice for that day. For eliminating filler words, you could pick one situation where you're going to be especially vigilant about noticing filler words. Maybe it's phone calls. You focus on listening to yourself during phone calls and catching yourself when you use filler words. For curating your linguistic environment, you could add one new source of high-quality language content to your week. Maybe it's listening to one podcast episode. Maybe it's reading one chapter of a book. That's your practice. For vocal mastery, you could read one poem out loud each day, or you could record yourself once a week and listen back. These are all small, manageable practices that you can realistically fit into your life. The key is consistency over intensity. You're better off doing a little bit every day than doing a lot once in a while. So as we're coming toward the end of this conversation, I want to step back and talk about why this all matters. Why are we spending time thinking about the way we speak? Why is articulacy important? I think it's important because communication is one of the most fundamental human activities. We spend so much of our lives communicating. We communicate at work, we communicate in relationships, we communicate in families, we communicate in our communities. And the quality of those communications affects the quality of our lives. It affects whether we get the job, whether we maintain our relationships, whether we feel heard and understood. When you can communicate with clarity and intention, you have access to opportunities that other people don't have. You're more likely to be heard, you're more likely to be taken seriously. You're more likely to have impact, and maybe more importantly, you're more likely to feel like your voice matters. You're more likely to feel confident expressing your ideas and your thoughts. But beyond the practical benefits, there's something deeper here. When you work on your communication, when you become more intentional with your words, you're actually engaging in a form of self-respect. You're saying, my thoughts are worth communicating clearly. The people I'm talking to are worth the effort of choosing the right words. That's a form of dignity, both for yourself and for the people around you. I also want to talk about the relationship between thinking and speaking, because I think there's an important connection there. The way you think affects the way you speak, but also the way you speak affects the way you think. When you use more precise language, it actually makes your thinking more precise. When you use more sophisticated vocabulary, it actually expands your thinking. They feed each other. So, in a way, by working on these pillars of communication, you're not just improving your speaking, you're also improving your thinking. You're becoming a more articulate, more thoughtful, more sophisticated thinker. And that's a beautiful thing. I also want to acknowledge that communication isn't one size fits all. Different people have different communication styles, different personalities, different ways of expressing themselves, and that's great. The pillars we've talked about aren't meant to make everyone sound the same. They're meant to help you access more of your potential as a communicator. They're meant to help you become the most articulate version of yourself. Some people are naturally very formal in their speech. Some people are naturally more casual. Some people are very theatrical and expressive. Some people are more understated. All of these can be articulate. The key is that whatever your style is, you're choosing your words with intention, you're pacing yourself thoughtfully, you're expressing yourself with clarity. I also want to come back to the concept of authenticity because I think it's really important. Sometimes people worry that if they work on their communication, they won't sound like themselves anymore. They'll sound fake or inauthentic. But I would argue that the opposite is true. When you're using your working vocabulary, when you're using those surface words that your brain defaults to, you're probably not expressing yourself fully. You're probably not accessing the full range of your thinking and your personality. When you expand your vocabulary, when you learn to use strategic pauses, when you work on your vocal expression, you're actually getting better at expressing who you really are. You're developing the tools to communicate your authentic self more effectively. So authenticity and communication skill go hand in hand. They're not in opposition to each other. One more thought I want to share is about the long-term benefits of working on communication. Yes, there are immediate benefits. You might nail that job interview. You might impress someone at a dinner party, but the long-term benefits are even more significant. Over time, as you consistently work on these pillars, people around you start to perceive you differently. They perceive you as more articulate, more thoughtful, more intelligent, more capable. Doors open, opportunities come your way. Relationships deepen because you're able to communicate more effectively. And maybe most importantly, the way you perceive yourself changes. As you see yourself becoming more articulate, as you notice that your words are having more impact, as you feel more confident in expressing yourself, your self-image shifts. You start to see yourself as someone who can communicate effectively. That confidence affects every area of your life. It's not just about speaking better, it's about becoming someone who knows they can express themselves effectively. All right, so let's create a really concrete action plan for you. Because I don't want you to finish listening to this and feel inspired, but then not know where to start. Here's what I recommend. First, choose which pillar you want to start with. I'd suggest starting with either eliminating filler words or vocabulary expansion, because these two tend to have the most immediate, noticeable impact. But if one of the other pillars really resonates with you, start there. The key is to start somewhere. Once you've chosen your pillar, commit to 30 days of focused practice on that pillar. 30 days is long enough to establish a new pattern, but short enough that it doesn't feel overwhelming. Set a specific, measurable goal for your 30 days. For example, if you're working on filler words, your goal might be, I will reduce my use of the word like by 75% in everyday conversations. If you're working on vocabulary, your goal might be, I will learn and use 5 new words in my speech this month. Find an accountability partner. This is someone who you can check in with regularly about your progress. This could be a friend, a family member, a coach, a therapist, whoever. The key is that this person will help keep you accountable and can offer support and encouragement. Start small with your practice. Don't try to be perfect. Don't try to do everything at once. Just pick 1 or 2 specific contexts where you're going to focus your practice. Maybe you're going to focus on your communication in meetings, or in conversations with a specific person, or in a specific type of situation. Having a specific context makes it easier to practice consistently. Track your progress. This could be as simple as keeping a journal where you note how many times you use a filler word, or how many new words you successfully incorporate, or how many strategic pauses you use. Tracking helps you see progress, and seeing progress is incredibly motivating. At the end of 30 days, assess how you're doing. Have you made progress? Yes? Celebrate it. You deserve it. Then, decide whether you want to continue focusing on this same pillar for another 30 days, or whether you want to move on to a different pillar. After you've made progress on one pillar, add a second pillar while maintaining the first one. Keep rotating through the pillars until all 5 are part of your regular practice. And then, create a maintenance plan for the long term. What practices are you going to continue doing on an ongoing basis to keep improving? Maybe you're going to continue recording yourself monthly and listening back. Maybe you're going to continue reading poetry out loud twice a week. Maybe you're going to continue being intentional about the media you consume. Figure out what's sustainable for you and commit to it. All right, as we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with some final thoughts and some encouragement. First, I want you to know that if you've been struggling with your communication, if you felt like your words don't express your thoughts the way you want them to, that's not a reflection of your intelligence or your capability. It's just that you might not have had the right tools or the right framework for improving, and now you do. You have 5 clear pillars that you can work on. I also want you to know that improvement is absolutely possible. You don't have to be born with the gift of eloquence. You don't have to have some special talent for speaking. Communication skills are learnable. They're trainable. Any person who commits to consistent practice can significantly improve their communication. What you're embarking on here is a form of self-improvement that will affect every area of your life. Better communication leads to better relationships, better career opportunities, more influence, more impact. But beyond that, it leads to a sense of self-respect and confidence that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. I also want to acknowledge that this is going to require effort. There's no magic pill. You're going to have to practice. You're going to have to be intentional. Some days, you're going to feel like it's not working, like you're not making progress. On those days, I want you to remember that you're rewiring decades of habitual patterns. That takes time, that takes consistency, but it's absolutely worth it. And finally, I want you to know that you're not doing this alone. There are millions of people around the world who are also working on their communication skills. There are communities, resources, mentors who can support you. And every time you practice, every time you use a strategic pause, or choose a more sophisticated word, or record yourself and listen back, you're joining a global conversation about the importance of articulate, intentional communication. So commit to this. Choose your first pillar. Start your practice, and I promise you, if you stick with it, if you're consistent, you will see results. You will become more articulate. You will communicate with more clarity and intention. Your words will have more impact, and your life will be richer for it. Before you go, I want to remind you of a few things that are really important to me and that help us grow this podcast community. Please, if you found value in today's conversation, hit that like button. Seriously, every single like helps our content reach more people who could benefit from learning about these communication principles. It tells the algorithm that we're creating content that resonates, and it helps us grow. And please, share this episode with someone who you think could benefit from it. Maybe it's a friend who's been struggling with their communication. Maybe it's a colleague who's about to give a presentation. Maybe it's a family member who you think would find this valuable. Your personal recommendation is more powerful than any marketing we could do, so please share. Most importantly, make sure you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. By subscribing, you'll never miss an episode. We're creating content regularly that's designed to help you level up your communication, your thinking, your overall effectiveness as a human being. And here's something I really want to emphasize. Check out our podcast playlist. We have curated some absolutely amazing episodes in there that build on what we've discussed today. If you're new to the channel, that playlist is the perfect place to start. You'll find episodes on different aspects of communication, different strategies for self-improvement, different ways to think about how you show up in the world. The playlist is like a curriculum for becoming more articulate, more thoughtful, more effective. You can find the playlist right here on the channel, and I highly recommend going through it if you're serious about developing your communication skills. Because these pillars we've talked about today, they're foundational, but there's so much more to explore, so many other dimensions of communication that we can work on together. So thank you for being here with me today. Thank you for spending this time thinking about how you communicate. Thank you for being willing to do the work of improving yourself. That's not something everyone is willing to do, and I genuinely respect it. I wish you every success as you practice these pillars and work on becoming a more articulate, more intentional communicator. Your voice matters. Your words matter. The world needs to hear from you, and you deserve the tools to express yourself in the most powerful way possible. Until next time, keep practicing, keep pausing, keep choosing your words with intention, and I'll see you in the next episode.